Thank you very much, Chair. And can I just preface the remarks I'm going to make by congratulating the Campaign for Social Europe and the People's Movement and PANA for having organised this discussion, this conference this weekend. I know you're going to be meeting tomorrow on related but separate debates, and I'm sorry I can't be with you. I would have been very interested. Indeed, one of my union colleagues will be with you. But I'm returning to Liverpool, where we are celebrating the centenary of the 1911 Transport Workers' General Strike, which actually took place in August, but we're celebrating in October, and you can make a joke about transport workers always being late if you like, but that's where I'll be tomorrow, and I'm sorry that I can't stay with you all that time. But Chair, colleagues, friends, let me just introduce myself first of all and say my name's Alex Gordon. I'm the National President of the RMT, which is the National Union of Rail, Maritime and Transport Workers in Britain. Although we do organise a small number of maritime workers based in the Republic, in ERA, both in Rosslare and Dublin, and we have a shipping branch as well in Belfast. But we withdrew from organising in the Republic as a railway union back in 1953 as a result of a conference decision, and helped to establish an organisation called NATE, the National Association of Transport Employees, which is now part of SIPTU. And so we have very fraternal and strong relations with SIPTU, and I'm very pleased to be here tonight and to be invited to address you. The title of this discussion, this debate, was Social Europe a con? So just for the purposes of setting up a debate, let me say at the out, I'm going to be saying yes, Social Europe was a con, and it is a con to some extent, although the level of the con has been undermined to a great extent by the crisis which we're seeing visited right across the EU 27, nowhere more noticeably than here in Ireland. The current economic crisis starkly exposes that EU structures do not exist in order to protect workers or public services. The Eurozone crisis itself has revealed that the most powerful member states, France, Germany, and to an extent Britain, are protecting their debt-laden banks by demanding vicious austerity measures in the EU 17, the Eurozone members, starting with Ireland, Greece and Portugal, and spreading rapidly right across the EU 27 member states. And along with the cheap credit-fueled growth and EU-funded infrastructure projects of the past 25 years, the illusory concept of social Europe, which was launched 25 years ago this year, more or less, is also disappearing in smoke before our eyes, while attacks on workers' rights and on systems of industrial relations, collective bargaining, gather pace across Europe, driven by EU institutions. The Commission itself, the European Central Bank, the EFSF, the Financial Stability Fund, and the latest incarnation, the European Stability Mechanism, which is being set up in parallel alongside the fund. The idea of a social Europe can be traced back to Jacques Delors, the finance minister in the first Mitterrand government in the early 1980s in France. Delors, who presided over the failed Keynesian relaunch of the French economy, believed that social democracy must reconcile itself to the market, something that we now talk about as social liberalism, and also to recast itself at a European level to allow Euro firms to compete on a global scale in emerging, increasingly integrated world markets. Delors evangelised for a social Europe when he became president of the European Commission in 1985. Though able to introduce some redistribution at a European level via structural funds, in fact, this period of the mid-1980s onwards was marked by the historical defeat of organised labour movements across Europe. And the post-war Keynesian model, the Keynesian welfare state, focused on full employment and stimulating demand by granting working classes a greater share of national wealth through rising wages. Under the model proposed by Social Europe, on the other hand, the Keynesian welfare state was gradually dismantled, restructured in the jargon, and replaced with an alternative that prioritised price stability over jobs and focused on wage moderation and labour market reform as the main route to maintain competitiveness. In some cases, such as in Italy and also in Germany, this change in direction was pursued through corporatist arrangements which were themselves set up during the Keynesian era, that is to say social partnership. In other cases, most notably in my country, in Britain, change came about through direct confrontation between organised labour and the state. Yet common to all of these different social contexts was the use that was made of Europe as a route via which social bonds and obligations of the Keynesian golden age were given up. Privatisation policies and the liberalisation of financial markets across Europe all came about as a result of decisions by national governments. Yet, these policies were subsequently implemented under the aegis of the European single market and with the help of the European Commission in order to limit the possibilities for opponents of the changes to mobilise at the national level. Looking at the leaders of social Europe, such as Germany and the Netherlands, the most successful followers of the model, the figures show how these countries have made use of what were in fact antisocial growth models. In Germany, the ability of the government to secure wage moderation from unions representing workers in its export industries has been absolutely critical to the country's success since the end of the downturn in the early 2000s. Similar policies have been pursued in the Netherlands, the country with the lowest unemployment in Europe, but also with the highest proportion of workers on fixed, i.e. not permanent, temporary work contracts. So you can see clearly in that example how insecurity, job insecurity, goes hand in hand with economic growth under the aegis of this particular model, the European social model. The growth model, which has propped up the Eurozone's average annual GDP figures, has created conflicts between member states able to achieve these kinds of internal competitive devaluations and those in the Eurozone's periphery, such as Ireland, where credit-fuelled growth has led to wage inflation. We see that these asymmetries are reflected in the figures for household disposable income as a percentage of annual growth provided by the OECD. So the average figure for household income, disposable income, as a percentage of annual growth for the period 2000 to 2008 in Germany is 0.6%, in Netherlands is 1%, in Spain it rises to 3.1%, in Ireland for a slightly shorter period, for which I've been able to find figures 2003 to 2008, but covering the same period, it is 3.8%. And the project of European Monetary Union went alongside and was historically coincidental with the extension of this anti-social Europe growth model. By preventing countries within the single currency from using currency devaluation as a way of regaining competitiveness, all the pressure for adaptation was transferred to the labour market. So with fiscal resources tied up in bank bailouts today, the reality of this transfer has now really begun to bite. Labour market reform, as it is euphemistically referred to, is the main tool available to policymakers today, with predictable consequences both politically and socially. Protests in European capitals from Athens to Madrid have now become a regular feature of European news in 2011, whilst policy making at the European level, isolated from the protests and complaints of national populations, has only intensified the drive for austerity and the demand for cuts in public services. And I'm arguing that this is not evidence of social Europe, but in fact what might more properly be described as anti-social Europe. Any evidence of social Europe is being rapidly replaced by this distinctly anti-social Europe model, characterised less by social partnership than by social dumping, as EU rules and European Court of Justice judgments drive a race to the bottom in terms of jobs, wages and conditions. The new European TUC General Secretary, Bernadette Segol, admitted in June of this year, cuts in salaries, cuts in public services and weakening collective bargaining rights are all on the agenda. And yet the same organisation that she represents, the ETUC, has spent the last 20 years an enormous amount of energy promoting the alleged benefits of social Europe and indeed of the entire European construction and European project. The ETUC's spokesman Alphonse Groenhaber-Pilgrim said 20 years ago, there is a mutual interest in getting this idea of European Union across. The European Commission needs the trade unions to implement the European Economic and Monetary Union. So where did it all go wrong? In order to explain the crisis of social Europe, we need to explore and understand where it came from and what it was designed to do. The genesis of social Europe can be found in the 1987 Single European Act, which in Britain was backed by the Tory Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher at the time, although she's spent an awful lot of energy, and her followers have, in the succeeding years, denying it. This so-called Act established a single European market with 4 fundamental freedoms, the free movement of goods, services, labour and capital. And as a way to bypass any national opposition, the Act introduced qualified majority voting in the Council of Ministers and replaced the rule of unanimity over this question of free movement of goods, capital, services and labour. This highly neoliberal policy was a recipe for mass privatisation on an unprecedented scale. And its architects were the EU Employers Federation, UNICE, I'm not quite sure how they pronounce it, and the corporate European group, the European Round Table of Industrialists. The ERT is an interesting organisation, not spoken about much, not mentioned very often in the financial pages, but it's worth knowing about. It's real, it exists, it has a website, if that's a mark of what a real organisation is. And it is its membership is strictly by invitation only. It's made up of representatives from around 50 companies, including Daimler Chrysler, Fiat, Nestle, Renault and Siemens, as well as UK companies like BP, British Petroleum, Rio Tinto and Rolls-Royce. It has a clear remit, which is to promote further EU integration to benefit European-based transnational corporations. In fact, a simple Google search of ERT, the European Round Table, reveals that this corporate group has been promoting free movement of services and labour across the EU for over 20 years, and really without any accountability or without much public comment whatsoever. In the early 1980s, Vissy Dekker, the chief executive of Philips, the Dutch company, and former EEC Industry Commissioner Etienne Davignon, drew together a group of leading European corporate executives and formed the ERT, the European Round Table, with the objective of relaunching Europe, quote unquote. They said, if we wait for our governments to do anything, we will be waiting for a long time. You can't get all tied up with politics. Industry has to take the initiative. There is no other way. That was Dekker who said that. Member states and much of the business sector had already rejected attempts by the European Commission to remove trade barriers within the EEC at that time and to create an internal market in 1984. However, the newly appointed European Commission President, Jacques Delors, delivered a speech to the European Parliament closely modelled on Dekker's proposals, which was to become, with the assistance of Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, the Single European Act. And to sweeten this neoliberal pill, Delors proposed a largely symbolic social charter to ensure support from the entire project from trade unionists and trade union leaders, particularly across Europe, particularly and especially in Denmark and the United Kingdom. Large parts of the labour movement fell for this contrick following Delors' infamous address to the 1988 British TUC conference, which promoted a Euro-federalist vision wrapped up in the language of social Europe. Delors told the British TUC delegates that the EU was the alternative, the EEC, the common market, was the alternative to mass unemployment, privatisation and endless Tory attacks on the working class in Britain. And in exchange for signing up the Euro-federalist project, Delors offered British trade unions a sympathetic ear in Brussels and a share in the economic benefits of EU membership. The European Round Table boss, Keith Richardson, went along with this charade at the time, saying, if politicians feel it is important to get the chapter referring to the desirability of full employment, and they think it will help public opinion, we don't really object, providing, of course, that it remains solely related to an aspiration. So you can dream, it's just you're not allowed to actually do. In fact, the Single European Act unleashed a corporate free-fire zone for the kind of turbo-capitalism which has been led by the finance sector, particularly in Britain, in the City of London, and which has led us into the current global economic crisis, while at the same time hypocritically lauding the supposed superiority of the European social model over Anglo-American free market libertarianism. This included promoting the increasingly complex financial contracts, instruments and credit vehicles based on speculation and gambling, which are currently unravelling across the European banking sector. UniCredit today, Dexia in Belgium yesterday, rumours of Deutsche Bank, Europe's largest bank, being in serious trouble, and for the last several weeks, rumours that French banks, including BNP Paribas and others, are in serious difficulties. The UK was already, at that time, the most neoliberal economy in Europe, and the alleged benefits to workers of a social Europe failed to materialise as over 1 million British manufacturing jobs disappeared between the late 1980s and 1997 alone. That process is continuing today in my country. In Germany, the number of jobless has passed 5 million, and French unemployment has now ballooned to over 10%. Moreover, the Single European Act should be seen as a fundamental part of the process of slowly and irreversibly centralising power to Brussels on a huge scale. And then, of course, we had a succession of other treaties, such as the Maastricht Treaty, which formally proposed the introduction of the single currency, followed in 1996 by the Stability and Growth Pact, which established strict convergence criteria for joining the euro. And this pact, the Stability and Growth Pact, represented a Thatcherite economic straitjacket across Europe that has enforced huge cuts in public spending and austerity measures on all member states. Since then, treaties such as the Amsterdam Treaty, the Nice Treaty, and the EU Constitution, the so-called Lisbon Treaty, have all sought to centralise economic, political and legal powers within the EU without a democratic mandate. The European Roundtable of Industrialists was clearly not content with these developments, and in January 2001, the European Commission formally launched plans for a services directive to force the wholesale deregulation of entire industries at a stroke. EU Commissioner Frits Bolkestein claimed that it was time to end the sector-by-sector process of liberalisation, quote, when so many of the necessary changes are common to a wide range of services. Some of the national restrictions are archaic, overly burdensome and break EU law. Those simply have got to go, he said. Bolkestein declared that Article 49 of the Treaty of the European Union says that all restrictions on the freedom to provide cross-border services within the Union are prohibited. The final genesis of Bolkestein's Services Directive had begun, and companies would be given the opportunity to undermine the best national conditions and wages and drive them down to the lowest levels. For instance, a German company would be able, under Bolkestein's conception of the Services Directive, to exercise its activities throughout the European Union, including in Germany, with one branch operating from the Netherlands, another from Belgium, depending on where the conditions could generate the most profit. Following this, the German Building Workers Union, IG Bau, warned of a wave of service provider relocations to countries which impose the lowest legal requirements on employers and exporting them back home. A number of rulings by the European Court of Justice highlight just how the internal market batters down the minimum standards established either in legislation or by trade unions at national level. One case concerned a Latvian construction company, Laval, which was refurbishing a school in the town of Vaxholm, just outside Stockholm, using Latvian workers on Latvian rates of pay which were much, much lower than the sectoral collective agreement in the Swedish building industry. The Swedish Building Workers Union demanded that a local collective agreement that covered Swedish building firms should be put in place to cover the Latvian workers. The company refused and referred to a Latvian agreement which they had signed with the Latvian union instead, which paid about a third of the Swedish wage and did not provide adequate work insurance. As this was a clear case of social dumping, the unions began industrial action by blockading the site. Laval, the company, argued that this action was not in compliance with EU law and brought the case which eventually ended up at the European Court of Justice. And as we now know, the European Court of Justice agreed with Laval that this was a case where their rights to provide cross-border services under Article 49 had been impeded. While in Stockholm, the EU Internal Market Commissioner, Charlie McCreevy, made it clear that the Commission fully backed the Latvian company and that the social dumping situation which it had created. In fact, he said, if member states continue to shield themselves from foreign company takeovers and competition, then I fear that the internal market will begin to dissolve. The question here is whether or not Sweden has implemented Article 49 in the Treaty on Free Movement. The Swedish LO, TUC, Trades Union Congress Vice President Vanja Lundby-Wedin pointed out that the industrial action taken by the Swedish Building Workers Union is by its very nature an obstacle to the activities of the company and to free movement. She said, what until now have been regarded as fundamental rights of workers in all democratic states would be undermined in the name of free movement. Following, very shortly following this, a case which had already begun ended up in the High Court in London, known as the Viking case. The Viking case involved industrial action by the Finnish Siemens Union against an attempt by a Finnish ferry company, Viking, to replace Finnish seafarers on collective contracts negotiated by the Finnish Seafarers Union with cheaper Estonian labour. The employer's claim, again in this case, was based on EU law and was that the industrial action by the Finnish Seafarers Union had violated the employer's rights to freedom of establishment and to provide services as provided for in the EU treaties, Articles 43 and again Article 49. And both of these cases highlight how EU treaty provisions on free movement is being used deliberately and methodically as a battering ram against trade union rights to take collective industrial action, even where that action is lawful under national law. And alongside the free movement of services, EU rules demand the complete free movement of labour, moves which will have profound effects on all trade unions operating within the European Union. Following the accession of Eastern European states to the EU, migrant labour has been rapidly moving west, while capital and manufacturing jobs are moving east. While Western European countries experience a large influx of migrant labour, East European countries are suffering population collapses. In the case of Latvia, 1/3 of the population of that country in 1989 has now left. Massive population falls, and those are amongst the brightest, the best, the youngest, the fittest, the best workers in that country, leaving it an almost impossible task for society to maintain itself. And an inevitable brain drain which leads to a loss of skilled labour in young people, as well as an uncertain future of underdevelopment. In more developed member states, wages have been under pressure in many sectors in a process known as social dumping, as cheaper foreign labour replaces indigenous workforces and trade union bargaining power thereby is severely weakened. And these problems have arisen here in Ireland, most notably in the Irish Ferries dispute in 2006, when Irish Ferries, the formerly state-owned company, replaced 600 Irish seafarers with seafarers' ratings from the Baltic republics, again, at considerably lower rates of pay. The Irish Congress of Trade Unions at that time demanded measures to protect particularly the unskilled workers where social dumping is threatening jobs. And the ICTU said it is an iron law of economics that an abundant supply of labour pushes down its cost. It is insulting people's intelligence to pretend otherwise. An admirably clear statement on the position. So across Europe, it is clear that what we are witnessing is a large movement of capital eastwards as labour heads west. And this is happening in accordance and because of the principles of the single European market, which allows for the free movement of goods, capital, services and labour, regardless of social consequences or national legislation. Single market rules, therefore, truncate all forms of national democracy, including the rights to fair wages, working conditions, welfare and social protection, collective bargaining and environmental protection. These EU policies can only mean a continuation of mass migration and ultimately feed the poison of racism and fascism, the last refuge of the corporate beast in a crisis, as our history tells us. So what do? To reverse this increasingly perverse situation, nation-states have to assert democratic control over not only their own immigration policy, but also must have the right to apply national legislation in defence of migrant and indigenous workers. The real question facing us as trade unionists today is, do we want social partnership or do we want independent trade unions? And it is increasingly clear that EU policies represent a wholesale attack on welfare, education and social structures which our unions, our organisations and our class have fought for hard over decades and decades. So what should be the response of the labour movement to this situation? The EU's strategy is clearly to use the free movement of labour, capital and services to undermine and destroy hard-won labour standards and public services. Their neoliberal drive will increase social dumping, displacing workers with cheap foreign labour and feeding racism and the far right. As a result, resistance to the EU's corporate agenda is appearing now across Europe, and there are growing levels of unease amongst working people to EU rules that shift the balance of power massively to the employer and big business and away from elected national parliaments. Instead of promoting social partnership, we have to ask ourselves, how can workers have the same interests as private corporate entities that lobby EU institutions to make it easier to exploit workers and bring down wages? Endless academic papers on the need for social partnership declaring the end of class struggle cannot hide the fact that trade unions should not be in the business of promoting rules drawn up by big business. These policies only favour corporate capital and the drive to maximise super profits by exploiting cheap labour within the EU and around the world. However, the European TUC, which is 80% funded by the EU itself, openly colludes with the Commission and employers' groups to promote this damaging from the point of view of workers, this damaging corporate agenda. Is this really what Europe's workers want? Ultimately, trade unions should exist primarily to represent their members' interests, not to act as a conveyor belt for the policies of unaccountable and remote EU institutions. The alternative we need to put forward is for trade unionists to develop their own democratic agenda based on the interests of their members and their communities. Trade unions have an important and legitimate political role to play as agents for social change, not as neutered partners of corporate interests. Millions of workers are finding the confidence to say no to social dumping and yes to protecting decent national standards. In order to protect jobs and our industrial base in the UK, RMT, my union, is demanding that the government invests in manufacturing, training, research and development. Manufacturing could create the wealth required to finance and develop the welfare state in the future, including our public health service, which still remains at the moment free at the point of delivery, at the point of use, free education and decent pensions. All governments need to have democratic powers to control the flow of capital, jobs and people, even if it offends neoliberal EU rules, laws and directives designed to favour corporate capital. These are the fundamental rights of any modern, democratic, independent nation, and I suggest that it is the role of trade unions today to blow away the myth and the con of social Europe and to say that we want to stand up for decent rights for workers in all of the countries across Europe, whether they're members of the European Union or not. Thank you very much.